Welcome to a Legacy of History Project Volume 3. My name is Corey Bright and this is
Brooklyn Black
and
Alex Collier.
Today, October 24th, we will be interviewing Dr. Edward at the Cambridge Narrows Regional Library. Our hopes are that you will enjoy listening to our interview with Dr. Edward Walter.
Welcome, Dr. Edward Walter. Cambridge Narrows Community School thanks you for participating in a Legacy of History project. I understand you were born in 1925 and have lived in Cambridge Narrows for many years. What is it like living and working as a doctor in this community 60 years ago?
Well, it was actually quite a challenge. Most of the doctor's training involved working in tertiary care hospitals where there's teaching programs, all kinds of x-ray facilities, dedicated lab facilities. Everything's at your disposal. All kinds of people that you can talk over your problems with. And all in all, when you get all of a sudden removed from this type of environment into a rural area, all of a sudden you are without any colleagues to discuss your problems with. You've got no hospital or medical facilities. Laboratory facilities are too far away to be of much help, so you have to do all this type of work yourself. X-rays, in order to get done, are rather complicated in the country. At that time, we had to, since most people worked on small farms, everybody had to be on the go all day long, trying to get the chores done. Somebody had to milk the cows twice a day. In order for that gentleman with his broken wrist or whatever to be x-rayed even, he had to find somebody else to take over the farm work for that day. He had to find transportation to get to town because many people at that time couldn't afford to have cars of their own. He would have to find somebody to drive him to St. John. It was a complicated thing, and then you had to wait around and have somebody look at that x-ray, and hopefully they would get back to you and let you know whether the cast that you put on the wrist showed that the wrist was in satisfactory position and it would be all right for him to return home. It was a complicated business, that type of thing. You had to do an awful lot of things that doctors in the city all they would have to do would be call a nurse to go out and look after the patient with such and such. This type of thing is left completely up to the doctor or somebody who might be able to give him a hand with in the country to carry out some of these things. You're on your own. You pretty well have to rely on your powers of observation. You had to use your ears and your stethoscope. You had to get a very careful history from all these patients. No shortcuts whatsoever. Since good 75% of all your diagnoses are achieved just by getting a proper history, and all these things had to be done by yourself without any outside help at all. Plus the fact that you still had to carry on with all your other activities, and it was quite a challenge.
So if it was such a challenge, why did you decide to practice in Cambridge?
Well, I sort of grew up in Cambridge, and I knew the countryside. I knew an awful lot of the people and their families. My father had practiced here some 30 years previously. The old house that I was born in across from the library here was available. The original office space was still there, and with a little bit of changing around, I was able to make myself the use of the old office. There was a little dispensary still there with a little bit of revision. Allowed me to make a local pharmacy because there was no pharmacy within X number of hours of here, so you had to make up most of your own medications and get them ready. Try to figure out all the costs of the bottles and labels and the tops and everything, and plus all the that type of thing. The basic stuff was there. Some of the old instruments were still there. Most of the ones for your local surgical procedures, the minor cuts and bruises and things like that. Pretty well had to get those new, but some of the old stuff was still usable. And I liked the people, I liked the lake, I liked to be able to get out and tramp around in the woods when it was still safe. And I just wanted to get some experience trying to do these things on my own, and probably gain a little bit of expertise and having an edge over other people who had not done that type of work.
Can you give us an idea as to your daily routine?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Can you give us an idea as to your daily routine?
Well, you sort of had a routine that you would like to follow. You get up in the morning and get your breakfast and everything all organized. The main thing in the morning was an attempt to get out and get all your house calls done around the country, and this of course included everything, Cody's and Narrows down Big Cove, all down around the lower Cambridge area, Gemsag, Coles Island. It was quite a fair amount of territory to cover. In the afternoon, if you're back after that morning of running around the countryside, you had office hours. Now this was something I had been warned about before, that in country practice you can't hold office hours. You just had to sit there and wait for people to come in anytime they wanted. I really couldn't see that this was going to be too practical, so we attempted to set up a certain length of time to allow for calls, and people could come in on a predictable basis, and it worked out very well actually. And afternoons and early evenings were pretty well taken up with office work, sorting out problems and trying to get a proper diagnosis and arrange for treatment of local problems. And then if you could still stay awake long enough, then you had to go and do some of your lab work, all your blood counts and sedimentation rates and all this type of thing with your analyses, and get them all documented. And bookwork was a bit of a problem. You had to, write letters here and there. This pretty well took you up to bedtime. And then, of course, there were always the emergency calls that were thrown in the midst of the day, so you had to work them in as best you could.
What types of medicine were difficult to get, and what did you do if you ran out of them?
Well, you had to pretty well, in the rural areas, you pretty well had to keep your own armamentarium in terms of medications. Most of them were fairly standard. You could predict that you were going to run into certain illnesses over a period of X number of years, and you kept a reasonable supply of medication to cover this. We used to allow for Thursdays, if at all possible, to go to St. John and get our supplies of medications and such from National Drug, which is no longer running as National Drug. We would bring these things back and sort them out and have them available. The big items that were difficult were treating a lot of infections, because this was still not really a wide open antibiotic time. The only antibiotics which were available at that time would be primarily the sulfa drugs. and they were getting to be quite widely used, and they were in a tablet form, or for the kids in a liquid form. The other ones that were becoming available was the penicillin. Now, penicillin was an excellent drug, but unfortunately at that time the only forms of penicillin were the injectable forms. And there was no long-acting penicillin. It had to be multiple injections during the day. Now, this was not too practical in the country. People couldn't sit on your doorstep waiting to get an injection 2 or 3 times a day. If it was a severe infection, you might have to either actually get them arranged to have those people go into town or stay with somebody in an area where penicillin could be administered so many times a day. Now, fortunately, most of the illnesses that you did come across were treatable with the sulfas. And sometimes some of the problems that did require penicillin, you knew that they would respond, and you'd have to make other arrangements. But those were the main antibiotic problems, and it was really a few years later when penicillin became available in tablet form. It made a huge difference because people could come in, get their medicine and go home and carry on for X number of days and then be re-examined and just to make sure they're responding. But the availability of most of the medications wasn't too serious because either we took a trip to town to buy these supplies ourselves, or there were 1 or 2 individuals in the community who were making almost daily trips to St. John with various produce or something, who could bring some of these back if I could make arrangements by the phone to get some sort of a medication that we didn't have on hand. So it wasn't a major problem.
Who were some of the people that you worked with?
Well, number 1 was my wife, Isabel. She was a nurse, and she had her hands full, with youngsters and so on. And a lot of the plaster of Paris casts and things like that we had to make up for broken fingers and bones, and certain types of dressings where we had to wrap around limbs and leave them on. A lot of the preparations of these things had to take place in the kitchen. And I was, sometimes we were competing for the use of the kitchen. But it worked out very well. Occasionally Isabel had to go out if I happened to have the flu or something like that and couldn't go out on house calls. And there was something pretty serious that I had to find out. She would volunteer to go out and check these patients and get word back to me. And it would be very helpful. And as I say, there were all kinds of things that the doctor's wife is, keep him from going crazy. One of the big projects. Other people, our next door neighbor, adjacent to the library here, Talbert Carpenter. Talbert was younger in those years, and during the time when the weather was very poor, and you would go out in some of these calls in snowstorms or heavy rains, and the roads were in pretty bad shape of those days. There was no paved roads, and sometimes you weren't quite sure whether you were going to get back or get over there to see the patient, and it was safe. It was safer in many cases to have somebody go with you, and just in case, or to help you when you did get there. Talbert used to volunteer to go along with me. It worked out very well. Another lady, Ada White. Now, Ada was a nurse. She was the wife of Walter White, who many people would remember quite well here. Ada used to go out and help us with home deliveries. She would be able to do a lot of the routine observing and everything during the early stages of somebody going into labor, for example. And when things got to the point where they needed a doctor, she could get word to me and I would be able to go over. And instead of spending the whole day there, it would free me up and allow me to rely on her pretty important clinical judgment when to call me and to get the baby delivered and look after all the other things. This was very helpful. Ada was very helpful. Another lady that was very helpful was Annie Perry. She was one of the, Annie Todd married John Perry, and they lived across on the narrow side. And Annie volunteered to give up one of the rooms in her home to obstetrical patients. Now, the deal there was she would look after these patients for 5 days. We would deliver the baby, and she would take over the care of the mother and the baby. And this was about the only holiday that some of these mothers had, was that 5 days off during the year. And she did a very good job of this, and if there were any problems, she could notify me, and it was very handy to know there was a spot where we could deliver babies in the community. We tried to encourage any people that we thought might have get into any complications. We encouraged these people to go to Fredericton or St. John and have one of the specialty people look after them if they thought there were going to be problems, and have the babies delivered there. But there were a number of people that they were always helping. There was always somebody available to help you get stuck if you got over on the side of the road, half upside down in the ditch, and everyone was very helpful.
Where did people go for operations?
Well, at that time, for operations, there was the occasional one in Sussex. I took a few appendixes out in Sussex, but a vast majority would go to either Fredericton or St. John. I knew physicians who, in different specialties, who worked in Fredericton and St. John, and depending on the type of surgery that was required, I would usually end up by driving them down there and assisting the surgeon at any procedure like that, and we'd turn the care of the patient over to him for follow-up in the hospital, and when they returned home, we could take over the post-operative care here.
How is Cambridge different now than from 60 years ago?
Oh, there's a big difference. I mean, you've got education-wise, you're a long way ahead. I can remember the old one-room schoolhouse was just put aside and mothballed. And when we came back here in 1952, that was the year when the new high school, which is now the municipal building, was opened. And that was a big thing. This brought more educational power into this area, and the concentration and availability of facilities and everything, it was a big step ahead. A little bit difficult to get things started in those days. The first year we organized a home and school association. I think I ended up as, as president of that either in the first or second year. I can't remember in detail. Funds were difficult to obtain. I can remember there was an area down in I think it's been taken over by the fire department now, but I think that was originally the gymnasium area. And we were trying to raise funds to get mats for the gymnasium. You had to start off pretty basic. And I ended up starting Friday night movies down in there, and movies were ordered up from one of the movie places in St. John. The movie would be brought up. We'd set up the projector on Friday nights, and I was out in the corridor there leading into the what is now the room where all the goings-on take place upstairs. I had just a desk there, and I was selling tickets, and had my old dog sound asleep under the bench, and all the films involved Robert Taylor. He seemed to be in all the films, and I guess this movie place where we rented these films from specialized in all his movies. I don't know whether he had a franchise or what, but it worked out very well. Helped gain a little bit of well, it brought the whole community together, because people did come in every Friday night, and it became a routine, which is very good. And it started to change the whole community. Right now, you've got this new high school, relatively new high school. The problems here now are different in the sense that with the way that the country has changed over the last 60 years. You know, there used to be small farms. Now there are hardly any left. You can't go to your next door neighbor and get all your vegetables, and the meat man doesn't come around once a week like they used to. You end up by having to go to town to Sobeys or the superstore to get your main grocery purchase for the week. The roads are better. People think nothing of going to Fredericton or Armagh or some other place to see a movie, for example. This would be unheard of in those days. And I think that all in all, the demographics have changed. You know, since there are no farms, it's not profitable to farm now. It's cheaper to get stuff from China. Even your vegetables and canned goods and all this sort of thing, it's ridiculous, but that's the way it's developed. And young couples now have difficulty finding the work that they want to do, which is quite often a bit more technical, so they end up by moving to town. And when they move to town and start raising a family, the kids which are going to require education will be educated in town. Rural population, youngsters are decreasing, schools are shrinking, and the government likes to close all these down. And I think you're well aware of the local problems that we're having now with the keeping rural schools going. And this is despite the fact that some of the areas to get a best education are in the areas that we have here in Cambridge Narrows. I think that it's a bit frustrating, but what can you do? I mean, you're up against the politics and finances and everything, and we're paying the penalty.
Can you tell us about your family?
Oh, sure. Well, I've got, at last count, 5 children. They're living all over the country. Son Bob is out in Kamloops. He's a physician out there. Mark is an electronic technician who is at present living in Edmonton. Kathy is a housewife and of various hobbies and 4 kids. She lives up in New Maryland. Jeff, who's a senior programmer analyst for Hewlett-Packard, he lives in Michigan. And Mary is our youngest. Mary lives in Quispam-Sis. They're all hale and hearty. We've got, once again, at last count, 13 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. And hopefully they'll give up and stop there.
Can you tell me who your mother and father were and what they did for a living?
Oh, sure. Well, my father's home was on Salt Spring Island off the coast of BC. He eventually went to university at McGill and took his hospital training at the Montreal General Hospital. Now, my mother's home was in Gagetown. She was one of the Babbitt family in Gagetown. My mother and another one of her sisters went to Montreal and took their training as nurses at the Montreal General Hospital. Mother and father both went overseas during the World War I and were close to the front in France. Now, during a lull in the time there, they got permission to return to England on leave, and at that point they got married. And after the war, my brother was born over in England prior to the family moving back to New Brunswick. While my father went back to do further training in Montreal, my mother and my brother stayed at Gagetown with the Babbitt family. And during this time, the petition went out from a lot of local people requesting my father to see if he would come and practice in Cambridge, which he eventually did. And mother and father and my brother moved here, and for the first couple of years, this was about 1920, and the first couple of years they lived over the Gordon Robinson store down the street, which is no longer present. But there was an apartment upstairs, and this is where the practice was carried on for the first couple of years. And then in 1923, my father built the house across the road from where we are, and we all moved into that area. Now, I didn't move in at that time. I wasn't born until 1925. But then in the approximately 1930, after my father had practiced here during those years and had documented much of his experience around here, which is very interesting, he eventually moved to St. John and spent the next few years working as an internist in St. John until 1939, when war broke out again. He joined up and spent much of his time initially in a camp. He organized a convalescent depot camp in Camp Sussex, which later moved up to Fredericton at the experimental farm. And when France fell and their tour overseas was canceled, he was hired as a medical consultant for the Canadian Army and spent most of his years during for the balance of the war doing consultation work as an internal medicine specialist traveling back and forth from British Columbia to Newfoundland. At the end of the war, he and Mother returned to St. John, and my father was appointed as Chief of Medicine at the Lancaster Veterans Hospital, where he worked until he retired in approximately 1958 or 59. He spent all these years practicing up in Cambridge, and any of his spare time, he immediately came back up here, which was, and of course it was during those years that my brother and I were also returned. Unfortunately, my brother was killed in a hunting accident in 1940, which did not help things. But basically, my father became a maritimer who originally lived out west. And Mother and her family have pretty well all petered out in this area now. And that's about the very brief summary of what they did.
Did you have electricity when you started working as a doctor?
Yes, we had electricity. I believe it was 1934 or 35 that electricity came into Cambridge. And we were able to shut down the old ice chest and all these things that were not run by electricity, and we were pretty well set up with electricity when I started to practice here.
What was your favorite thing to do as a child?
Well, some of them are rather ridiculous. I can always remember, usually the first trip up in the spring from St. John, for example, would be to go around the property and see how many frogs and toads were available to count and help to collect eggs from, and so on and so forth. I had a little thriving business at one point. As a youngster, we would identify the legs floating in the pond, retrieve some, put them in appropriate containers, and incubate them to try and mimic the environment that they were in. Most would hatch, and we would watch this, and you know, the hind legs start to develop, and then the front legs would start to develop, and the tail would get shorter. And about this time, then you could, when they were basically identifying themselves as small frogs or toads, you could sell the occasional one for 2 or 3 cents to some of your friends. And what the deal was, they would be able to take these little creatures and do their best to maintain them until they're big enough to release on their own. And I don't think I didn't really make any money on this type of thing, but it was a project. We were very interested in wildlife, and we were always trying to patch up young birds and snakes and all kinds of things like that. You couldn't go to a store and get things. You had to do things on your own. Our first boat, for example, was made from, as I remember, 3 logs sort of strapped together. You see, in those days, all the lumber from the country was not brought out by trucks. It was mainly brought out by the waterways and formed in rafts. And of course, on the way down the Washtenamoik and over to Reed's Mill in Gagetown, some of these logs would come loose, and they would be scattered around the shore. So it wasn't too difficult to pick up some logs, put them together, improvise a bit of a mast in the front, and get an old broken paddle that you could try and steer. A cousin of mine who used to spend his summers here would help me. He'd be at the back of the tiller. He'd have a broken oar in the back trying to steer this thing. And I'd be up in the front trying to hold the mast up. It's very difficult to bore a hole in a log and stick this in, so usually you ended up by trying to hold it up. 2 spars, one on the top and one on the bottom, and the sail was made out of some burlap, which most of the wind went through the sail rather than against. At any rate, when you push that out in the lake, you could get a fair amount of leeway, and if it was a little bit of a northeaster blowing, you could go down push it off the shore, and very carefully, slowly, you would work your way down towards the old covered bridge. The only problem was when you got near the old covered bridge, if you remember the velocity of the wind, which ordinarily would go where the bridge is deflected and goes underneath the bridge, so it increases the velocity. And every time you'd try and go underneath the bridge, this gust of wind would take the sail. I'd have a hard time hanging on. And at that point, the bow of the so-called boat would go down and get under the water. And instead of staying parallel with the water, usually very quickly the whole thing would end up 90 degrees pointing towards the bottom. So you immediately had to give up and jump in and swim to shore. So these were the problems, but it did help to teach us a little bit about boating and how to make things and how not to make them. We used to also have cart races. We would make carts out of discarded wheels from previous damaged carts, I suppose. Rear wheels, front wheels, with a board down the middle. The wheels were stapled on, the axles were stapled on the cross piece. It was a pretty flimsy thing. It didn't last very long. And the steering was with a stick, backwards and forwards. And this, you had to, when you were going around the corner we'd start by going down the hill by which is right at the top of the hill here, and go down there. And the route was actually, when you got to the bottom of the hill, you had a sharp turn to the left, right down the street. And in those days, the road used to be right straight down right to the wharf, and right down. And if you didn't turn when you got on the wharf, you were in the lake. And they had slips down at that time when the riverboat used to come up, where they would take the goods out of the boat and they would bring them up the slip. And there wasn't just a log across the whole thing. And this allowed things to be loaded on the ship off and on. So we would get some bales of hay or straw and put them around those slips. And when you went roaring down the hill, you managed to pull back on the steering wheel rather than push forward, or you're in trouble. Take a run down the main street. Unfortunately, that was all just a dirt road. And fortunately, there wasn't too much traffic coming across the old bridge, so you weren't as worried about traffic as you are now. Go roaring down on the wharf, and you had to very carefully make that left turn and sort of make a big U-turn to come up on the wharf to slow down. Occasionally, you couldn't do it, and you ended up by going to splash right in the lake. But these were challenges, and learned you a little bit about what to do and what not to do in terms of building things and using your hands, and no harm done. Wrecked a few bales of hay or straw. Other things were, building our own kites, flying kites. You'd just start by getting some simple strips of cedar off a board, putting them together in a formation of a cross, and putting some twine around the edges. And of course, there were no sheets of plastic available in those days, so you ended up getting a tough piece of paper that you could find, cutting a little bit of a margin outside the twine, folding it over all the way around, and of course there was no glue. So The answer to that was to get a hold of some flour and make a paste of the flour and turn this all over and wait for a sizable amount of time till this dried, and then rig up the twine, which was pretty cheap. The twine had to be put on the, to guide it, and you had to be sure that you had it adjusted right to catch the wind, to get the right angle and everything. And there again, it taught you how to use your hands and do a little bit of thinking and everything. I can remember on one occasion flying one of these kites. It was a pretty big one, and we were flying it just across the road here, and there was a north wind, and the kite was way up in the air. It must have been, now by way up, it's probably at that time about 50 feet. And as I say, the twine wasn't that good. We had no nylon twine or anything those days. At any rate, it was doing very well. It was a rather wet day out, and I wanted to try and keep the all this old paper thing off of from getting down on the wet grass. But all of a sudden, the string broke. And, of course, the kite started to flop around, and in the meantime, the string got down and got in the wet grass. And as it did, it created drag on the string. And the string was long enough so that when it did this, it created enough drag so that the wind was able to hit the kite and actually keep it up, because the drag from the string was enough to keep the kite up in the air. Well, I went running down across the field trying to catch this thing. Of course, it outpaced me, and it went right down across where it's now across the highway where the bridge would end up there now, and right over to the wharf. And at that time, as I say, there was quite a bit of the string was wet and was still dragging on the ground and everything else. I gave up and just watched it, and it never did come down. The string got in the water from the lake, and it created just enough drag from all that big long line of string, and this darn kite kept flying all the way across and probably ended up on the shore over by Cox's Cove somewhere. Laws of physics, yeah.
I understand you have a love for animals. Can you tell us a few stories about rehabilitation of animals?
Yes, that's a pretty broad topic. Over the years, we have been exposed to a lot of problems with, particularly with wildlife. We have always had dogs in the family. Since we got married almost 60 years ago, we've always had English setters in the family. And these poor dogs have been exposed to other forms of animals, usually wildlife, and they have a hard time understanding why all these animals aren't as friendly as all their doggy friends are. We have, while we're practicing, not too much time was allowable for looking after a lot of these animals, but in later years, when I was out duck hunting, for example, I noticed that some people were shooting down some ducks on the marsh and not retrieving the creatures when they fell. This was very upsetting, and on the way home, I would go over to the general area and put my English setter through some of that area and would pick up the occasional wounded duck. If it looked as if it was salvageable, we would bring it home, patch it up one way or another, and if it was releasable, we would keep it until the wounds had healed, the fractures had healed, and then we would reach a point where we could release it quite frequently on a semi-reserve environment in Lily Lake, where there were other ducks that spent much of the winter there. Actually, it was primarily after we retired that there was a bit more time that we could spend in trying to look after some orphaned and injured animals, many of which turned out to be raccoons, which are one of the few animals that you can raise and release, and they will go back and successfully into the wild. Others you cannot. We have raised young birds. Now, most of those are fairly short term. People bring them in. They're not sure what kind of birds they are. But at that age, if they're that young, usually you can raise them on a pretty standard diet of insects. You just have to know as soon as you can what type of bird the parent is, and this gives you a clue as to the type of food that will be required when the bird gets older. But most of the young ones, if you can get them to the stage where they are able to fly reasonably well, they can be released, and they learn very quickly how to look after themselves. Raptors are another problem. These poor creatures have to be able to hunt and fly better than the other birds, because this is what their life depends on it. Certain types of fractures are repairable. Others may heal, but not in a position, particularly if it's near a joint, where they will be able to fly well enough to survive. And legally, or as a rehabilitator, a licensed rehabilitator, as we were at the time, these birds should be destroyed. Now, unfortunately, being a physician and looking after humans of all sizes and shapes and personalities, we've always been used to trying to care for those who are not going to look after themselves, or probably wouldn't be able to look after themselves, or they've got all kinds of problems that they can't cope with. And this sort of carries over into the wildlife. I'm not a good rehabilitator. If an animal can be salvaged, even with a goose with one wing that had to be removed, this animal, otherwise in good health, can be used for educating people on all about wildlife and how to look after them and how not to look after them, how to deal with the general population of wildlife. We've always been able to find a special home for some of these birds, along with other cripples, where they can be protected. Moncton Zoo has been very helpful. Another wildlife zoo in Shubenacadie has taken some raptors, which are beautiful animals, but some of them will require rehabilitation for a long period of time and then can be released. Others may just stay there permanently, but they have big enclosures and they're in with other birds of the same species, so they're all right. Getting up into the larger owls, we've done great horned owls. Have to find special barns and supply them with mice and frozen day-old chicks, keep them going. They do very well given a chance. Other creatures, you pretty well, if you know darn well they're not going to be able to be released on their own, it's just they're better put down, which is no different than giving them an anesthetic, and just give them too much anesthetic and they're gone. but it's a challenge. The big challenge is in the spring when the young creatures are available. Unfortunately, always too many. You get 4 or 5 young raccoons. They're only a few days old. You've got to get the bottles out and mix up formulas. They have to be fed 3, 4, 5, sometimes 5 times a day when they're very young. It takes a lot of time and a lot of energy, and you have to be very careful. You have to know what to do if they get dehydrated and so on. Once again, most of the ones that we have raised, you're talking 30, 40, 50 of them. My wife can give you an actual number. I can't. These animals can be released the following spring when they're old enough to be on their own, and in the spring they have to be released well away from humans because they have been raised by humans who have looked after them, provided them shelter and food, and they just assume that all humans will supply food and shelter, which is not true. The next person they see may just greet them with a 2x4 over the head. So, away from humans, alongside a brook where there are probably creatures alongside the brook for food, young frogs, birds' eggs, anything that you and I would like, the coons like as well. And they very soon learn that not everybody is healthy, and they have to be careful of who they associate with, and they do very well. I think that right now we do have one raccoon who's he weighed 100 grams when we got him a couple of years ago, and the only reason we still have him, and he's been in this library a number of occasions when he was growing up. There's a group of kids in here were helping us with the educational programs and teaching them how coons grow and who they are. They named him Chester, and Chester's still with us. And the reason we didn't release him was that we have the only other one that we have left is an old raccoon by the name of Maggie. And Maggie's 11 years old, which is 2 or 3 times as old as they would be normally in the wild. Maggie was starting to lose weight, and I didn't think she was going to get through 2 winters ago at all. She was losing weight, wasn't eating, and wasting away. Just a shadow of her former self, and most of ours have very seldom got beyond 10 or 11 years. One of 12 last year. At any rate, when Chester got big enough, he went from 100 grams, he's right now probably at least 30, 35 pounds now. And all of a sudden, old Maggie got interested in this little thing when he was growing up and sort of took him under her wing, so to speak. And first thing you know, they were playing together, and all of a sudden, Maggie had a purpose in life, and she started to eat and gain weight, and her fur increased, and you wouldn't know, you'd swear she was a young adolescent herself now. She's done surprisingly well, and because of that, we have kept the 2 of them together. Well, Chester's a bit of a character because when he was born, it was late in the season. He never would have got by to Christmas. He just didn't have enough fur on him, and he wasn't big enough. His mother probably didn't know why she had him in the first place, and he just wouldn't have survived because he was born too late in the season. At any rate, so the first year we had to pretty well raise Chester in the sun porch and in the kitchen. Well, when he got bigger, unfortunately, Chester got to know of all the drawers in the kitchen. He knew every one and what was in it. He knew where all the pots and pans were, and he loved to get in them and drive us crazy. We ended up by trying to, this past year, keep him just out in the sun porch when he comes in when they come in to get their food once a day. And but Chester hasn't forgot anything about that first year. I had to keep him in the sun porch area, which was sort of coon-proof. And I tried to barricade the door. I put a Dutch door, and I had to modify that whole thing. I think it was on 14 different occasions, because no matter what I did, he could climb out. And this year we just had to put the steel door on and close it. And every once in a while, and of course he takes the majority of the food now, and he'll take his and Maggie's and everything else if he can get it, because he's big. And you have to be very careful, because every once in a while, when one of us goes in the kitchen to get some water or something like that, he will all of a sudden make a dash for the kitchen. And if he gets through the door, if he gets his head in the door, there's no way you can stop him. He'll get into the kitchen, and before I can get in there and stop him, he knows that third floor, that third drawer down, is the one that contains the cookies. And he can open that door, flip the lid off, grab a handful of cookies, and before I can get anywhere near him, he's reversed engines and he's charged out into the sun porch and out through the other door, out into the quarters outside, with at least one of these great big chocolate chip cookies or something. And I can't do a thing about it. You can't get out. He's so fast, he gets out there and you can't stop him. But and he just has not forgotten all these areas in the kitchen, even though he's not in there now. But it's a challenge to keep up with him. But you know, we're used to this sort of thing. But it's amazing how smart they are.
Dr. Walter, we would like to thank you for your time and for sharing your stories, your experience, and memories about your life.
Thank you.
This concludes our interview with Dr. Edward Walter. Thank you for this opportunity, a Legacy of History project.